I didn't wake up to an alarm that morning. I woke up to police lights crawling across my front yard. 3 patrol cars parked sideways, blocking my driveway like I'd committed a crime. My 2 daughters stood frozen behind me on the porch. And across the street, my neighbor was smiling. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. At 6 in the morning, neighborhoods are supposed to be quiet in a peaceful way. The kind of quiet that smells like fresh coffee, damp grass, and routine. That morning felt different. Heavy, controlled. The low rumble of idling engines replaced birdsong, and red and blue lights reflected off my garage door. My fence, the bicycles, my kids had leaned there the night before. No sirens, no shouting, just presence. My daughters didn't cry. That's the part that still sits with me. They stood shoulder to shoulder, backpacks already on, watching officers step out of their cars and scan our house like it was a problem that needed managing. They were old enough to read faces, old enough to know something wasn't right. One officer walked up slowly, hand resting near his belt, but not on it. His voice was calm, rehearsed. "Sir, we received a complaint about threatening behavior." Threatening. I looked at my driveway, looked at my truck, looked back at him. I didn't argue. I didn't laugh. I nodded and did exactly what years of training had taught me to do when someone else was trying to provoke a reaction. Hands visible. Voice steady. Answers short and factual. Across the street, my neighbor held her phone chest high like it was proof of something. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look uncertain. She looked satisfied. What she couldn't see, what she didn't understand, was that this call didn't put me in trouble. It put her actions into a system that remembers patterns. People hear my title and imagine volume. Aggression. Authority raised like a weapon. That's not how real authority works. Real authority is quiet. It listens. It documents. It waits. At home, I'm not a rank or a role. I'm a father who wakes up early to make coffee strong enough to cut through exhaustion. I check locks at night out of habit, not fear. My world revolves around 2 10-year-old girls who need consistency more than explanations. My wife was away that week, on official travel, the kind where phone calls are calm and nights are not. My father lived with us, 273, a Vietnam veteran. Some days, his memory was sharp. Some days, it drifted. But every single morning, without fail, he recognized my voice. Something about the cadence pulled him back, even if just for a few minutes. That house wasn't just where we lived. It was an anchor. The officers finished their questions. No tickets, no warnings, just notes. The kind that look harmless until they're stacked together and stripped of context. As the patrol cars pulled away, the street felt suddenly exposed, like something private had been put on display. My neighbor stayed where she was, watching them leave like she'd just won a round. I walked up the porch steps and knelt in front of my daughters. "You okay?" I asked. They nodded, but one of them hesitated. "Did you do something wrong?" "No," I said. "Neither did you. If you're watching this, and you're still here, subscribe now, because that question mattered more than the police ever did." That morning changed something, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. This wasn't reactive. It wasn't confusion. It was a test. And the person running that test believed pressure only worked one way. She was wrong. 2 days later, the first letter arrived in the mail. That's when I realized this wasn't about my driveway at all. The first letter arrived 2 days later. White envelope. HOA logo in the corner. My name printed perfectly. Centered, precise-like. Someone wanted it to feel official before it felt personal. I opened it at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed, already knowing what it would say. Notice of violation. No accusation. No explanation. Just a code number, a subsection I'd never heard of, and a fine printed neatly at the bottom. Clean language. Polite tone. The kind of letter that assumes guilt without ever saying the word out loud. I didn't react. I folded it once and set it aside. By the end of the week, there were 3 more. Different envelopes. Different subsections. Same calm voice. One for vehicle positioning. One for visual obstruction, one for something so vague it could have applied to anyone on the street if someone wanted it to. That's the trick with paperwork. By itself, it feels small. Together, it feels intentional. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't confront anyone. I started a folder. Manila, plain. Labeled with a pen. Dates on the tabs. Copias in seed photos attached. Notes in the margins. Not because I enjoy documentation, but because experience teaches you that systems only respect records. My daughters noticed before I thought they would. Another envelope arrived one afternoon. Slipped halfway under the door. One of them picked it up carefully, like it might bite. "Is this another one?" she asked. "It's just paper," I said. She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Kids know when adults are simplifying something that isn't simple. My wife called that night from her hotel room. She'd already heard about the police. "Are we okay?" she asked, trying to sound steady. "We're fine," I said. "Everyone's safe." There was a pause. Distance has a way of making silence heavier. "I hate not being there," she said quietly. "You don't need to be," I told her. "That's my watch." When you hung up, I spread the letters across the dining table. Dates, codes, fine amounts. They weren't random. They were spaced close enough to feel relentless, far enough apart to look coincidental if someone glanced quickly. That's when the pattern started to form. Late that night, while the house settled into its familiar creaks and hums, I pulled public HOA records. Meeting minutes, past enforcement logs. I wasn't looking for outrage. I was looking for consistency, and I found the opposite. The same violations appeared again and again across the neighborhood's noise, parking, fences, flags. But enforcement wasn't evenly applied. Civilians received warnings. Military families received citations. Same issue. Different outcome. Military households made up less than a quarter of the neighborhood. They accounted for nearly 3/4 of the fines. That isn't strict enforcement, that's selective pressure. Across the street, my neighbor waved every morning like nothing was happening. Same smile, same polite tone. She talked about standards the way some people talk about gravity, inevitable and unquestionable. If you're still watching right now, subscribe, because what started as paperwork was already turning into something coordinated. By the second week, the letters escalated. Noise violations for starting my truck too early. Unauthorized modification for tightening a loose fence board. Improper display for a flag mounted exactly 1 inch outside an approved guideline. Each one assumed I'd comply quietly. Pay the fine. Adjust my behavior. Maybe decide it wasn't worth staying. My father watched from his chair as I added each letter to the folder. Some days he was distant. Some days he was sharp. That week, he said very little, but he watched everything. One night, after the kids were asleep, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The problem wasn't the rules. The problem was who they were being used on. People who crave control don't hate chaos. They hate independence. The more calmly I went about my days, the more I refused to react, the more pressure appeared. Letters became leverage. Silence became fuel. And the worst part, this still wasn't the real attack. The real damage didn't arrive in my mailbox. It walked through my daughter's school doors. The first sign wasn't another letter. It was my daughter standing in the doorway after school. Backpack still on. Shoes not kicked off the way she always did. She didn't run inside. Didn't start talking the second she crossed the threshold. She just stood there for a moment too long. "Dad," she said quietly, "Mrs. Ellison told me I can't be safety patrol captain anymore." I knelt in front of her instinctively. That's what you do when something matters. Why would she say that? She shrugged, eyes down. Kids learn early how to hide confusion behind small movements. She said it wouldn't be fair if we moved soon. "Move," I repeated. Her sister appeared behind her, jaw tight in a way that didn't belong on a 10-year-old. Tommy's mom said military families don't really stay, that we don't belong the same way. Those words hit harder than any fine or citation. I pulled them both into a hug, and felt how fast their breathing was, how tense their shoulders had become. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about identity, about being quietly labeled temporary, disposable, inconvenient. "We're not going anywhere," I said, "and you belong wherever you stand." T nodded. Whether they believed me or just needed to, I couldn't tell. From the living room, my father had been watching. Some days he drifted in and out of clarity like a radio losing signal. That day, he was fully present. After the girls went upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, eyes sharp. "She reminds me of the political officers," he said suddenly. I looked at him. "What?" "In Saigon," he continued, voice steady. "They didn't carry rifles. They carried paperwork. Smiled while they ruined lives. Said it was for order." He looked up at me then. Same eyes. "Samunger." Then, just as quickly, the moment faded. The fog returned. But the words stayed. A few days later, I saw exactly what he meant. At the school board meeting, my neighbor moved through the room like she belonged there. Handshakes. Leaned-in conversations. A blazer, and that practiced expression people wear when they want to look responsible without being questioned. When she took the podium, the room quieted. "Military families bring unique challenges," she said carefully. "Frequent relocations. Deployment stress. Instability that can affect learning environments." She clicked to the next slide. Charts. Percentages. Selective studies stripped of context and arranged like evidence. She never said my name. She didn't have to. "Recent incidents in our neighborhood," she continued, glancing in my direction without looking at me, "have raised concerns about intimidation and continuity." That's when something inside me went cold, not angry, not emotional. Precise. This wasn't ignorance. This was a campaign. If you're still watching, subscribe here, because what I uncovered next proved this wasn't just bias. It was coordination. That night, my wife called before I could even say hello. "They're talking about the kids," she said. "Other spouses are hearing it too." "How many?" I asked. "Inug." I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. "On the line." "Okay," I said finally. "For what?" "Say, ask it." For me to stop pretending this burns out on its own. After we hung up, I opened the folder again. Letters, dates, notes, and something else I hadn't paid enough attention to yet: meeting minutes. Attendance lists, names that kept repeating across HOA records and school committees. I added a new tab and wrote one word across it in block letters: children. Because once someone is willing to use kids as leverage, there's no misunderstanding left. No benefit of the doubt, no room for patience. Karen thought she was applying pressure where it hurt. She was right. What she misjudged was what happens when you push a parent far enough, especially one trained to recognize patterns. That night, I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking how, and the answer was hiding in a place she never thought I'd look. The house was quiet in that late-night way that feels heavier than noise. No cartoons murmuring from the living room, no footsteps upstairs, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the wall clock marking time without caring what it was counting down to. I opened my laptop at the dining table and pulled the folder closer, not the manila one, the digital one. I wasn't looking for proof yet. Proof implies doubt. What I was looking for was structure. Organization. The kind of order people create when they believe they're being careful enough that no one will ever connect the dots. HOA boards are required to keep records. Minutes, logs, correspondence. Most of it is dull, repetitive, and forgotten the moment it's filed. Bureaucracy depends on that. It assumes no one will ever read everything. I did. I started with meeting minutes from the past 2 years, downloaded them, lined them up by date, cross-referenced attendance lists with voting records. Names began to repeat, not randomly, but consistently. Then I found the shared drive. It wasn't hidden. It didn't need to be. It sat behind a login most residents never bothered to request, because most people don't expect to be targeted by their own neighborhood. Inside were folders labeled by year. Inside those, and inside one of those, a file that made my hand pause over the mouse. Compliance monitoring. Primera click. The spreadsheet opened clean and simple. Roust of numbers addresses. Dates. Notes. Columns labeled status, action, escalation. It looked professional, neutral, the kind of document that pretends to be objective. Then I saw the column titled occupancy type. Civilian, civilian. Military, civilian. Military. I scrolled. The military entries were highlighted. Yellow at first, then red. Next to my address was a note so clinical it felt unreal. Persistent non-compliance. Recommend pressure escalation. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. I opened another folder. School liaison notes. That one wasn't supposed to exist. It listed dates of meetings, names of committee members, and shorthand phrases that looked harmless until you read them together. Leadership instability. Relocation risk. Community continuity concerns. Next to my daughter's name was a single line that tightened my chest. Target to remove. Not review. Not reconsider. Remove! I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. This wasn't enforcement. It wasn't bias. It was planning. If you're still watching at this point, subscribe, because what I uncovered next didn't just explain what was happening. It explained who was behind it. I moved slowly after that. Methodical. I saved copies, took screenshots, downloaded metadata, checked timestamps, and edit histories. The same 3 names appeared again and again across HOA records, school notes, and committee communications. Karen's name was on every single one. Sometimes as the author, sometimes as the reviewer, sometimes as the last person to open the file before an action was taken. She wasn't reacting to events. She was coordinating them. I checked one more document before closing the laptop. A worksheet titled Communications. It logged calls, emails, and informal conversations. The dates matched the days my kids came home quieter than usual. The days the school office called, the days HOA letters arrived back to back. The spreadsheet didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. It spoke in patterns. At some point, my father shuffled into the doorway. He looked smaller in the dim light. Older, more fragile. "You working late again?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just reading." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep. By morning, the decision was made. Not to confront, not to accuse, not yet. Documentation first. Preservation. Corroboration. I reached out quietly. A neighbor here, a parent there. I didn't lead the conversation. I listened, and one by one, the stories lined up with a spreadsheet almost perfectly. Same phrases, same pressures, same outcomes. By the end of the day, I had copies stored in 3 places and a list of witnesses who didn't even know they were witnesses yet. Karen thought she'd built a system too complex to challenge. What she'd actually built was a record. And records don't argue. They don't shout. They used weight. Karen believed paperwork was power, so she escalated straight into a system that doesn't care about smiles. And that's when she crossed a line she couldn't step back over. The email didn't come from the it didn't come from the school. And it definitely didn't come from my neighbor. It came from a federal inbox. The subject line was short. Clinical. The kind of line that doesn't waste words because it doesn't need to. Civilian complaints, officer conduct review. I opened it slowly, already knowing that whatever was inside meant something had shifted. Karen hadn't stopped with paperwork. She hadn't stopped with pressure. She'd taken everything she'd been building and pointed it somewhere else. The complaint accused me of abusing authority, of intimidation, of creating a hostile environment for civilians. The language was careful, neutral enough to sound credible, sharp enough to trigger mandatory review. She'd attach photos of my truck, copies of HOA, summaries of witness statements that echoed the same phrases I'd been seeing for weeks. This wasn't escalation. This was transformation. By filing knowingly false statements with a federal agency, Karen hadn't just continued the conflict. She'd crossed a line that doesn't bend. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I forwarded the email to legal counsel, then to compliance, then saved it in a new folder labeled with a single word. Line of. That evening, my wife called. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm listening," I replied. "To?" "What?" To the sound of someone making a mistake they can't undo. She didn't ask me to explain. She didn't need to. That tone, the one where emotion drains out and procedure takes over, we both recognized it. The next morning, my phone rang. "Colonel," the voice said. "Professional and measured. This is Lieutenant Colonel Webb from Base Security. We need to speak with you regarding a civilian complaint that crossed our desk." I told her I was available. She didn't ask for details. She didn't accuse. She didn't reassure. "Bring whatever documentation you have," she said. I brought everything. The HOA letters, the spreadsheets, the timelines, the recordings, the foreclosure records. The room we met in had no windows and perfect acoustics. The kind of place where words don't echo because they're meant to stay put. Webb reads silently, page after page, without interruption. At one point, she stopped and looked up. "Did this individual submit the complaint directly?" "Yeah." "And are the allegations accurate?" "No." She nodded once and continued reading. When she finished, she leaned back slightly. "By submitting knowingly false statements to a federal entity," she said, "this individual may have exposed herself to serious consequences." She paused. "This changes jurisdiction." That afternoon, Karen doubled down. She sent follow-up emails, clarifications, addendums, each one sharper than the last, each one adding details that couldn't obey, but if she wasn't correcting the record, she was trying to control it. That's when my security system sent a notification I almost ignored. Almost. The camera faced the side of my driveway. Not much to see, but audio matters more than sight sometimes. Karen stood just beyond the frame, phone pressed to her ear, voice relaxed. "This should be the final complaint we need," she said. "Once they remove him from command, the rest will fall into place." She laughed softly. "These military families drag property values down. They never stay. Better if they move on." I replayed the clip twice. Then once more, quieter. That wasn't frustration. That was intent. I preserved the file, verified the metadata, sent it to legal counsel with a single line of text. Smoking gun attached. An hour later, Webb called back. Her tone was different now. "Do not engage further," she said. "Preserve all recordings. We will handle contact." That night, I slept for the first time in days. Not because I felt safe, but because I felt finished waiting. By morning, the complaint was no longer under review. It was under investigation. Karen believed paperwork worked through repetition, through volume, through sounding official long enough that no one looked closely. She forgot one thing. Federal systems don't respond to narrative. They respond to patterns. She thought she was filing complaints. Instead, she was building evidence against herself, and the next notice she received wasn't from the HOA. The notice didn't arrive with sirens. There was no knock at the door. No dramatic confrontation, just an envelope delivered like any other, thin, formal, and impossible to ignore once opened. "You are requested to appear." No explanation, no accusation, just a date, a time, and a location she never expected to see printed on official letterhead. Karen assumed it meant leverage. She assumed it meant she was finally being taken seriously. People like her always confuse attention with authority. She arrived at the base just before 2 in the afternoon, white SUV rolling through the gate with visible impatience. Base security treated it like any other vehicle, entering controlled space, slow, methodical, thorough. She stepped out, arms crossed, irritation written clearly in her posture. Civilians underestimate how quiet military spaces are. There's no chatter, no background noise, just procedure. The conference room was already set when she entered. Flags behind the table, a recorder centered between 3 folders placed with deliberate symmetry. I didn't sit at the head. I sat off to the side. Agent Morrison from the FBI took the center seat. Jag sat to her left. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood near the wall, observing. Karen paused. This wasn't the room she'd imagined. I was told this was about a complaint, she said, already framing the story. Please have a seat, Morrison replied calmly. Karen sat. Morrison slid a single page across the table. This is the report you submitted alleging abuse of authority and intimidation. Do you affirm that these statements are accurate? Yes, Karen said without hesitation. Morrison turned on the recorder. Let the record reflect that the witness affirms the accuracy of her prior statements. Then she opened the second folder. We're now going to play an audio recording captured on a private security system. Karen stiffened. I don't consent to... Consent isn't required, Morrison said evenly. This is evidence. Karen's voice filled the room. This should be the final complaint we need. Once they remove him from command, the rest will fall into place. Military families bring property values down. The room stayed silent when the recording ended. Karen didn't look angry. She looked confused, as if the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. That's out of context, she said quickly. I was frustrated. I was speaking generally. Morrison opened the third folder and turned it so Karen could see. A spreadsheet. Her spreadsheet. Names, addresses, status, escalation, a column labeled occupancy type, another note highlighted in red, target to remove. JAG leaned forward slightly. You should be aware that systematic targeting of service members and their families may implicate federal protections. Karen laughed once, sharp and brittle. This is intimidation. No, Morrison replied. This is documentation. She slid one final page across the table. A deed transfer. An LLC. A foreclosure. A military family forced out and a profit made quietly afterward. Karen stared at the paper. For the first time since I'd known her, she said nothing. She finally looked at me. You did this? No, I said calmly. You did. Morrison closed the folders. Mrs. Ashford, based on the evidence presented, this matter is now under federal investigation for false official statements, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. I want a lawyer, Karen said. Of course, Morrison replied. You're free to retain one. Karen was escorted out without handcuffs. Without spectacle, people like her expect force. What ends them is certainty. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. Tay nebbered. Within days, HOA enforcement was suspended pending review. Within weeks, the board dissolved and was replaced under outside oversight. Karen resigned for personal reasons. The federal process moved quietly. Interviews, subpoenas, restitution. My daughters felt the change before the paperwork finalized. The sideways look stopped. The school calls ended. Laughter returned at full volume. One morning, my father looked up from his coffee with unexpected clarity. She was like the political officers, he said. Same smile, same hunger. Then the fog returned, but the truth stayed. Weeks later, a letter arrived from a family I'd never met. We didn't think anyone would take this seriously, it said. Now we're documenting. That's how this ends. Not with shouting, not with revenge. Wheat clarity. Paperwork doesn't make power clean. Intent does. And the call Karen made that morning meant to humiliate a man in his own, did the opposite. It exposed her, because systems don't collapse when you argue with them. They collapse when you illuminate them. If you stayed until the end, subscribe. Not for drama but for stories where quiet truth wins.